Big picture in the middle. That problem.
Insight.
But you have insight.
Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Again, good morning. I want to welcome our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. Today's hearing continues the subcommittee's oversight of NASA's major program areas and will focus on the agency's exploration initiative. In many ways, NASA's exploration initiative exemplifies both the strengths and weaknesses of the agency at this point in its history. Begun in 2004 to implement the President's vision for space exploration, NASA's initiative was conceived to be a broad and sustained program of human and robotic exploration of the solar system. It was to be a step-by-step approach to exploration, and starting with the completion of the International Space Station and subsequent retirement of the Space Shuttle, development of a new human space transportation system, and a return to the Moon as an initial step in a long-term journey to explore the solar system. It was also to include an ambitious set of robotic exploration activities and scientific investigations. Yet from its beginning, NASA's exploration initiative has suffered from chronic underfunding, with a once-in-a-generation project to develop a new space transportation system shoehorned into a NASA budget that in some years hasn't even kept pace with inflation. That same underfunding has led to cutbacks in the space station research and critical exploration technology investments that will be needed if NASA's initiative is to go beyond simply being a repeat of the 60s era Apollo project, albeit on a somewhat larger scale. This is in no way a criticism of the dedicated NASA team that is developing the systems needed to take America's astronauts below low Earth orbit. They are working hard to make the best of a tough situation, and we want them to succeed. To that end, today we will hear from NASA about what has been accomplished to date, and we will examine what NASA is going to have to do to bring those new systems into operation. Yet we will also have to take a hard look at what it's going to take to make the initiative both sustainable and worth the money. A good number of my colleagues agree with me that we should be investing more in NASA, but there isn't necessarily a consensus on what those funds should be used to accomplish. For example, I think exploration is a worthwhile endeavor, and I do support it. However, it is also clear to me that NASA's core missions in aeronautics and science, especially earth science and climate research, are highly relevant to addressing the nation's needs and must be better supported than they have been. Thus, if the next administration keeps NASA's budget as constrained as it has been under this administration, and I certainly hope it doesn't, then the pace of exploration is going to have to be adjusted to ensure that NASA's other important activities do not wind up being cannibalized. Yet whether or not NASA gets more money, we also need to ensure that the money NASA does get is spent as effectively as possible. Thus, at a minimum, NASA needs to follow good program management practices and do its best to control costs, something the GAO witness will discuss. NASA also needs to do a better job of keeping Congress informed of its progress on critical initiatives so we can determine if they're proceeding in the right way and on budget. In addition, it means that we need to make sure that NASA's program is structured in a way that ensures that the critical long-term exploration and research and technology investments will be made. It also means that we need to ensure that the activities we carry out on the Moon don't become a counterproductive drain on NASA's and the nation's resources, but instead help further our long-term exploration goals. Finally, it means we need to ensure that we don't succumb to a temptation to rerun a space race that we already won nearly 40 years ago. Instead, I think we need to be reaching out to fashion a new internationally cooperative approach to exploration. That, more than any nationalistically driven competition, will ensure that U.S. leadership in space is maintained in a way that will deliver the maximum benefits to our citizens for decades to come. We've got a great deal to discuss today, and we have an expert panel to help us sort through all of these issues. And I again want to welcome you, and we appreciate your willingness to testify before us today. The chair now recognizes Mr. Feeney for an opening statement, the ranking member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful for your holding today's important hearing on NASA's exploration initiative. I also want to thank all of our witnesses for coming, one of whom is wearing a proud Florida Gators cap, and we're always glad to see Florida Gators here in our presence. Your perspectives and expertise are immensely valuable as we carry our oversight responsibilities and prepare legislation to reauthorize NASA. Human space exploration defines America as the world's preeminent spacefaring nation. Images of Shuttle and Apollo are deeply ingrained in American culture, both our domestic version and the version exported to the rest of the world. Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of Americans and foreigners come to Florida Space Coast to witness a shuttle launch. And for the latest launch, held at 2:28 a.m., a sizable congressional delegation flew down after final votes in order to watch the night turn in today in front of their very eyes. For all the respect and support I have for NASA's satellite missions, those launches simply don't draw those crowds. NASA's human spaceflight program is in the midst of a once-in-a-generation transformation brought about by the Columbia accident. We're excited by the promise of human exploration beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in over 35 years. NASA's Constellation program is developing the Orion Crew Exploration Vehicle and the Ares 1 and the Ares 5 launch vehicles. This architecture will give NASA the ability to return Americans to the moon by 2019 and to establish a scientific outpost so we can gain the expertise to advance human exploration beyond the moon. But these changes come with significant costs. Earlier this week, NASA released preliminary estimates of the impact to human spaceflight workforce from this transition to a new generation of spaceflight vehicles. I know this hearing is not intended to focus on transition issues, but I do want to reiterate my concern about the length of this gap and the potential loss of the skilled workforce necessary to continue human spaceflight under the Constellation program. Mr. Chairman, I understand that you intend to hold a hearing later this year to examine NASA's shuttle transition planning, and I'm very grateful for that proposed hearing. I look forward to working with you on that hearing because it is of utmost importance to Florida's Space Coast, and I believe the nation as well. In the wake of the Columbia accident Investigation Board correctly observed that America's human spaceflight program lacked a strategy and a direction. We have halted that drift. America has established a strategy and an architecture of how to achieve our goals. Now we need stability. We've had enough turmoil and change. If we change the strategy and architecture every few years, we will revert to pre-Columbia behavior, and we will have similar results, including the very real prospect of being grounded for several years while other nations, especially China, strive for space preeminence. And I'm grateful for the chairman's remarks about avoiding a unnecessary space race. I intend to go to China the third week of April for the first Global Space Summit. I'm adding this off the script. I think it is certainly very aggressive of the Chinese to host the first Global Space Summit, but not very surprising given their announced intentions to be very aggressively pursuing space capabilities. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board correctly noted, it is the view of the board that the previous attempts to develop a replacement vehicle for the aging shuttle represented a failure of national leadership. Since Columbia, we collectively, the President, Congress, and the space community, have demonstrated the necessary leadership. The chairman's right. We haven't funded adequately all of the things we asked NASA to do, but in terms of establishing a vision that is very doable, that will lead us into the next age of space exploration, I think that all of us have done our parts in a relatively responsible way. In over 5 years, we've come a long way since those terrible dark days in February of 2005. Let's keep that progress in mind as we look forward to the challenges ahead. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Feeney. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record without objection. So ordered.
Sorry.
Let me turn now to our excellent panel of witnesses. I'd like to introduce each one of you in turn, and then we'll return to our first witness, and he can begin the testimony this morning. First, we do have Dr. Richard Gilbrech, who's NASA's Associate Administrator for the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate. Next to him, Ms. Cristina Chaplain, who is a Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management at the Government Accountability Office. Third on the panel, Dr. Noel Hinners, who is a former Lockheed Martin executive and worked on the Apollo program during his tenure at NASA. And finally, we have Dr. Kathryn Thornton, who is a veteran of 4 shuttle missions and is currently a professor and associate dean for the School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia. Welcome again to all of you. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. We will start with Dr. Gilbrech.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today as NASA's Associate Administrator for the Exploration Systems Mission Directorate. When I joined NASA, I had two dreams. One was to be an astronaut, and the other was to be part of the next moon landing. Heart murmur dashed my first dream, but here I am today, thrilled to be leading the effort to achieve my second dream. Much has happened since Americans first landed on the moon. Today, space affects everything we do in more ways than I can count here today. The global space economy exceeds more than $220 billion annually, and NASA is just a small but integral component of that critical global economic engine. Fiscal year 2009, NASA has requested $3.5 billion for our exploration systems programs and projects. This budget request fully reinstates our $500 million commitment to the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program. It also demonstrates the President's continued commitment to our nation's leadership in space, especially during a time when there are other competing demands for our nation's financial resources. Budget stability is critical to maintaining the March 2015 initial operating capability for the Orion Crew Exploration Vehicle and the Ares 1 crew launch vehicles. Therefore, I ask for Congress's support for this budget request, as well as your continued support for NASA's efforts to successfully transition its workforce and infrastructure from Shuttle to Constellation. NASA's 2009 budget request also continues our efforts to return Americans to the moon by 2020. On the moon, astronauts plan to build an outpost to support a long-term human presence there, and in doing so, the moon will become a proving ground for technologies needed for future human missions to Mars and other destinations. NASA has put together a team of some of its best scientists and engineers to work on the lunar program, and we also are working with 13 other international space agencies and the commercial sector on this important endeavor. Today, Constellation is making real progress. We are testing real hardware. We have tested landing systems. We have logged thousands of hours in wind tunnels to simulate how the current Ares 1 vehicle designs perform in flight. By the end of the year, Exploration Systems will launch its first lunar spacecraft from the NASA Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Together, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and the Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite aboard this spacecraft will help NASA scout for potential lunar landing sites and outposts. For someone like me who started my career in propulsion technology, this is an exciting time to be leading the team that is building our nation's next generation of human spaceflight vehicles. Future astronauts will ride to orbit in the Orion Crew capsule on top of the Ares 1. The Ares 1 first stage uses a 5-segment solid rocket booster derived from the Shuttle's 4-segment booster. Its second stage will use a J2X engine and will provide the navigation, guidance, control, and propulsion for the rocket's continued ascent. Although the J2X has heritage parts, the J2X is essentially a new engine because of the significant redesign required for the Ares 1 propulsion. Having grown up around rocket engine stands, I am very confident, though, that NASA will be successful in developing this new engine to support both the upper stage and the eventual Earth departure stage that will return humans to the moon. However, with any new rocket development program, there will be some technical challenges. One of the most recently discovered issues is a problem with thrust oscillation produced by the 5-segment first stage booster. Thrust oscillation is caused by vortex shedding inside the solid rocket motor, similar to the wake that follows a fast-moving boat. It is a problem that is common to all solid rocket motors and one we take seriously. When early analysis indicated there would be high levels of vibration throughout the entire vehicle, NASA assigned our best talent to attack the problem. I'm pleased to report today that NASA has made great progress in better understanding the issue and identifying numerous mitigations for thrust oscillation. Last year, the U.S. Government Accountability Office acknowledged that NASA has taken steps toward making sound investment decisions for the Ares 1 project. Let me assure you that NASA fully intends to make sure that all of our projects, not just the Ares 1, reach the appropriate level of maturity at each milestone before proceeding further. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, NASA looks forward to continuing with you on this exciting journey of exploration, a journey that will drive new technologies, enable new economic activity, and engage and inspire our technical and engineering workforce. We do not live in a static world. Other countries will explore the cosmos, whether the United States does or not, and these will be the Earth's great nations in the years and centuries to come. Bold plans and strategies require bold leadership and robust follow-through, and together we can create a legacy for generations to come. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbrech. Before I recognize Ms. Chaplain, I notice you have some models here, and maybe for the viewers and the citizens in attendance, you might just take another minute and identify these models to your right for us.
Yes, sir, I'd be glad to. A little show and tell always helps. What we have here on the far end of the table is the Ares 1 crew exploration, crew launch vehicle rocket. We're using the 5-segment solid rocket booster that's derived from the Space Shuttle program as the first stage. The orange section up at the top is the new upper stage that will carry house the J2X engine that we're developing. And then the white portion at the very tip is the service module and the Orion crew exploration vehicle. And the little pointy stick at the top is the actual launch abort system, which gives us the reliability and the ability to save the crew in the event there's a mishap on our way uphill. The large rocket to the left is the Ares 5, which uses a lot of the common hardware that we are using with the Ares 1. We again have the two 5-segment solid rocket boosters on each side. We're using a core stage, which has 5 RS-68 engines, which are the engines that power the Delta 5 rockets today, the Delta 4 rockets today. We have the Earth departure stage at the top here, which is actually, we use the same common J2X engine. And then we also have up top the fairing that houses the Lunar Surface Access Module. We actually have the Orion, a little bit bigger picture here, but the idea is the large rocket will put the Lunar Surface Access Module in orbit. The crew will be put up on the Orion capsule. They will mate in Earth orbit rendezvous and then go on their way to the moon, and we'll send all 4 astronauts down to the lunar surface for 7-day sorties in the beginning. So that's the baseline of the architecture.
What are the blue arrays there that...
Those are the solar arrays for powering the Orion capsule. Since it has to, it's much more efficient with the lunar program to use the solar arrays and maximize the energy and minimize the amount of batteries and other types of things we have to have.
Thank you for that tutorial. Ms. Chaplain, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here today to discuss our work related to NASA's future space exploration efforts. We have been focusing our work primarily on the Ares 1 launch vehicle and the Orion crew exploration vehicle, as they are among the first major efforts conducted as part of the Constellation program and represent a substantial investment. Over $7 billion in contracts has already been awarded, and nearly $230 billion is estimated to ultimately be spent over the next 2 decades for Constellation. NASA is currently working toward preliminary design reviews for these vehicles. This is a milestone that successful organizations use to make hard decisions about whether a program should proceed forward with development. The phase leading up to a preliminary design review is a time for discovery and risk reduction. As such, it is expected that there will be unknowns as to whether program plans can be executed within schedule goals, as well as what they will ultimately cost. Best practice organizations close these knowledge gaps by the time they commit to programs, which is usually shortly after the preliminary design review. We have identified several issues that should be under close watch for the Ares 1 and Orion projects leading up to their preliminary design reviews. These include, first, progress in requirements definition and related impacts on weight of the vehicles. NASA cannot accurately estimate costs and schedules until requirements are defined. At this time, requirements such as those relating to how the Orion will return to Earth are among those still in development. Second, progress in technology development, particularly with the J2X upper stage engine and the Orion heat shield, since they require significant work. Our reviews of space programs consistently find that the later technology discovery occurs in a program, the higher the risk of cost increases and schedule delays. Third, schedule slippage. Delays in setting requirements and technology development have resulted in some schedule slips, which may increase costs. Moreover, there's a high degree of concurrency in both schedules. While this approach can save time, it can also create delays and cost increases, since additional rework may be required to address unexpected problems. Fourth, progress in resolving thrust oscillation problems. As Dr. Gilbrech has just commented, NASA recognizes this is a serious risk, and it has taken reasonable measures for dealing with it. Fifth, progress toward adding testing resources. Existing facilities have been insufficient so far to adequately test the J2X engine and the heat shield for the Orion. However, NASA has appropriately increased attention to this area too. In responding to our recent report on Ares 1, NASA agreed that these are high-risk areas and committed to delay preliminary design reviews if it has not yet attained critical knowledge on them. This is important. The long-term nature of the vision, its inherent challenges, and the magnitude of the investment at stake make it vital that the right decisions be made early on and that senior leaders have the right knowledge going forward so they can make informed decisions. It is also important that NASA continue to be realistic and open about the progress it is making and to be willing to make changes to the program if technical problems cannot be solved with overly compromising performance. This is difficult to do in any large government acquisition. The need to make adjustments is often unwelcome news, particularly if they may require more funding or time than originally promised. But pushing off problems in fear of losing commitments to a program invariably leads to much more time delays and cost growth, and thus less resources for other needed investments. We appreciate the candor of the program officials to date, and we look forward to continued discussions on progress. This concludes my statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hinners, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to share with you some of my perceptions of aspects of NASA's exploration program. Those include the incorporation of science in exploration, the current architecture, and international cooperation. Mr. Feeney, I appreciate your recognition of the Gator. I also propose that the Gator might be a good logo for the Congressional Witness Protection Program. Ever since Sputnik, there has been a not always constructive tension between space science and human spaceflight. This is based on the fact that they are largely two different cultures driven by different motivations. Yet each has much to offer the other, as was early demonstrated in the Apollo program, during which incredible leaps of scientific knowledge accrued, despite the fact that Apollo was politically motivated. Science also became a major component of Skylab, Shuttle, Space Lab, and the International Space Station. The National Research Council Space Studies Board undertook a major review, which I had the honor of chairing, of science to human spaceflight, or in human spaceflight in the 1990s, with the goal of improving science contributions to human spaceflight and gaining from it. In conducting the study, it became evident that there are management principles that, if followed, improve the return on investment. Those form part of the basis of the management recommendations in the recent Space Studies Board report, The Scientific Context for the Exploration of the Moon. They were extended to account for specifics of the proposed lunar exploration architecture. Briefly, we propose that NASA develop an integrated human robotic program, recognizing the incredible leap of capability in robotics, as evidenced by the current Mars exploration rovers. Making clear the priority between multiple goals of exploration is essential to minimizing misunderstandings. For example, a lunar outpost primarily as a stepping stone preparation for eventual Mars human exploration versus sortie missions, which are primarily for science benefit. Establishing an Apollo-style management structure can help in productively merging the two cultures of science and human spaceflight. Given the almost 50 years between Apollo and current plans for return to the moon by 2020 or so, it is imperative to bring advanced technology and instrumentation into play both for lunar surface applications and for upgrading the capability to analyze return samples. Many of these recommendations have major budget implications for both NASA's exploration mission and science mission directorates. Given the already stressed NASA budget, it is not at all clear that NASA can implement an effective lunar exploration program. Its goals are more ambitious than Apollo, yet without the generous funding that enabled Apollo. A go-as-you-pay philosophy will ultimately cost much more than an optimally funded program, as we have so painfully seen with the International Space Station. The vision for space exploration contains a goal of eventually exploring Mars with humans, a goal that today is impossible to accomplish in a technical, if not budgetary, sense. The lunar architecture for our exploration is then based largely on the precept of using an incremental approach to developing the eventual capability to explore Mars with humans. The overall planning implies a leap from lunar exploration to going to Mars sometime in the decade of the 30s. Given that the lunar program can develop only a very small part of the capability to explore Mars, the absence of a stepwise approach using, for example, missions to libration points and/or asteroids begs for development of a total exploration architecture. Such should include a lunar exit strategy that will avoid the kinds of issues we now face in trying to transition from the shuttle and the space station. We must not ignore the contributions to be made to eventual human exploration of Mars by the Robotic Mars Exploration Program. It is a highlight of NASA's programs, one that has truly captured the public interest. It is revealing a Mars not envisioned a short 4 years ago, and provides further reason to believe that Mars holds the greatest likelihood of advancing our understanding of the potential of life originating elsewhere than on Earth. Recent NASA cuts to that program are ill-founded and have the prospects for doing serious damage, just as the plans for a Mars sample return have been rejuvenated. A well-structured, properly funded, and thus vigorous Mars robotic program will add immensely to determining what it is that humans will eventually do on Mars. And, as important, obtain data critical to determining the very feasibility of such. NASA's program plans are clearly ambitious. Required and desirable is that many of them be done as international collaborations. This can take advantage of both the increased abilities and desires of potential partners. Obtaining program commitments and proper budgetary support in which Congress can help, and relieving some of the more burdensome aspects of the international traffic and arms regulations can go far to help bring about productive collaborations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Dr. Hinners. Dr. Thornton.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to be here today. My name is Kathryn Thornton. I am a professor at the University of Virginia, but I appear here today not in my faculty role, but as an organizer and co-chair of an independent workshop entitled Examining the Vision, Balancing Exploration and Science that was held last February at Stanford University. The workshop was co-hosted by Stanford University Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics and the Planetary Society. Other organizers were co-chairs Scott Hubbard from Stanford University, Lou Friedman from the Planetary Society, and Wes Huntress of the Carnegie Institution of Washington. The intent of the workshop was to critically examine the current implementation of the vision for space exploration as announced by President Bush in January 2004. The vision as originally put forth was rich in scientific goals aimed at finding life elsewhere in the universe, pointed toward Mars as the ultimate target for human exploration, and couched exploration of the moon in those terms. 4 years later, implementation of the vision has focused on a small subset of the original concepts, finishing the International Space Station for our international partners, retiring the Space Shuttle by 2010, developing new launch vehicles and a new crew vehicle, and the moon as the near-term goal of human exploration. Much of the originally planned funding for the human exploration mandates has not materialized, and instead has come from science, aeronautics, and technology. With these concerns as the motivation, the workshop was planned as a 2-day, behind-closed-doors discussion of the goals and implementation of the presidential directive and the issue of balance between exploration and science. Organizers sought to bring together scientists, astronauts, engineers, policy analysts, and industry executives in a single conversation where insights across traditional boundaries could occur. Invitations were extended to individuals whom the organizers felt would bring great diversity of thought as well as expertise. Each participant was invited to take off his or her corporate, institutional, or advocate hat and engage in discussion that will help this nation have the best possible space exploration program. To the extent that the outcome might be critical of current plans, progress, or goals, criticism was intended to be constructive and consistent with strong support for space exploration. As expected, lively discussions ensued. There was some doubt that 50 individuals selected specifically for their differing specialties and divergent views could reach a consensus on the goals and directions for America's space exploration program over the course of a 2-day workshop. Therefore, there was no predetermined workshop report or product, rather the expectation that these discussions would lead to further study and output in some form. Nevertheless, workshop participants did reach a consensus on 4 substantive statements, which in essence endorsed the vision as announced in 2004. Those statements are listed in my written testimony as well as in the workshop joint communique. I'd like to expand on the workshop consensus from my own perspective. It's time for humans to go beyond low Earth orbit. To be sure, the ISS must be completed in order to fulfill obligations to our international partners. But in the longer term, the Space Shuttle and the ISS serve to anchor humans in low Earth orbit. And orbiting the Earth, as thrilling as it is not exploring space. This nation must move forward with the development of a space transportation system that will do more than just orbit the Earth, but will enable humans to explore in space. Although Mars and beyond was, as a goal of human exploration, is a consensus of workshop participants, the question of intermediate steps was debated at great length with no overall agreement. A stepping stone approach to Mars might include sorties to the Moon, the Sun-Earth Lagrange points, near-Earth asteroids, and the Martian moons. The important point is that each of these stepping stones, whichever they may be, should advance the science and technology needed for the next more ambitious objective and the eventual human exploration of Mars, and none should be considered as permanent outposts that would again anchor us in place for decades. Exploration should be goal-driven, not schedule-driven. Practical engineering for meeting exploration milestones is bound by 3 major constraints: budget, schedule, and requirements. If you change one of these 3, the other 2 must change accordingly. Particularly if the budget is over-constrained, either schedule or requirements must give. It's important to remain focused on the goal, not the schedule, and proceed as efficiently and safely as technology and budget will allow. Sustained human exploration requires international collaboration. We can debate the value of science objectives and exploration goals, but the value of international cooperation in space ventures over the last decade cannot be challenged. Inviting meaningful international participation in the exploration architecture may reduce cost, accelerate timelines, provide additional capability, bring a measure of stability through numerous budget cycles and administrations, while engaging rivals and allies in a shared commitment to extend the boundaries of humankind into new domains. In summary, it is time to go beyond LEO with humans as explorers. To do so, we must have a space transportation system that will enable humans to travel to the Moon, Mars, and beyond. Without it, any debate of destinations for human exploration is pointless. And finally, with the goal clearly in focus, budgets and schedules must be balanced for an affordable, sustainable, and successful space exploration program. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and the subcommittee for your staunch support of the space exploration program and the opportunity to express my views today, and I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton. Speaking as a member of this committee, I wanted to express my appreciation for the Stanford workshop, and you undertook that effort with the same spirit of risk that you undertook the 4 missions to Shuttle as an astronaut. So thank you. And I know the members on the panel noted with interest your term lively. To describe the discussions you had. We have a lot of lively discussions here in the United States House of Representatives as well. At this point, we'll open our first round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. And I'd like to start by Dr. Gilbrech focusing on Constellation, in particular the status of the CEV and the CLV projects. First, are there any Constellation-related contract modifications in process or being contemplated that would alter, add tasks, or change performance requirements? And if so, what are they, why are they needed, and what's the cost impact of the changes? Easy set of questions, I know.
Yes, sir. Well, as you're aware, we've got all the stack under contract. We've finished all the Ares 1 contracts by the end of 2007. We have been working with Lockheed Martin in the Orion arena. We had done 1 contract mod in April of last year that accounted for several of the changes that were as a result of things like moving the date from 2011 to 2013, some of the launch abort system tasks that we had added. So we had made that contract mod, and that value went from $3.9 billion to $4.3 billion. Right now, we're in the process of going to PDR, so we've got our best take on the requirements that we have, and we're negotiating with Lockheed Martin. We'll inform this committee as soon as we have those negotiations firmed. Those are all negotiated terms that are within the reserves of the project, so we don't expect that there should be any challenges presented by that, and we'll be happy to report those as.
Thank you, and the committee looks forward to those ongoing reports and any additional information you might want to add to fill out the question I asked. Ms. Chaplain, if I could turn to you, what do you see as the greatest risks to the successful development of the Constellation system, and are you satisfied that NASA has developed a sufficiently detailed risk management process to help monitor and mitigate risks for Ares and Orion?
We haven't assessed their risk management process in and of itself, but we've certainly relied on it to help us identify the risk areas, and it's been very useful in that regard. So I think the technical and requirements risks are very well understood. When it comes to developing risk mitigation strategies, the important thing is to see how they're tied to dollars and schedule, and I believe that's what NASA has been doing. In terms of the overall risks we just see going forward, they are pretty much what I mentioned in the testimony. At this point, it's making sure requirements are fully defined by the time you hit that preliminary design review, and then gaining all the knowledge you need on technology development, especially with the components that are requiring a bit of new work, like the J2X engine. And going forward, the two things that we'll always be looking at are things like funding commitments and making sure they're sustained. Whenever you have disruptions, they have a lot of reverberating effects on a program. So if there are future things like continuing resolutions, we would be looking to see what the subsequent impacts of those things are. You just mentioned requirements changes or contract changes, which are normal at this point in the cycle. What we would look at going further, once you've committed to the program, you've passed your preliminary design review, what kinds of changes do you make at that point, and what kind of consequences do they have on the program?
When you mention continuing resolutions, of course, the United States Congress plays a role in continuing resolutions, so I appreciate you reminding us of that important responsibility. If I could turn back to Dr. Gilbrech, do you agree with the GAO's assessment of the risks and uncertainties that remain, and in your opinion, what are the leading risk areas associated with the CEV and the CLV, and how do you propose to mitigate them?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. We've worked with GAO on their report, and we appreciate the responsibility they have in reporting to Congress. We always want to maintain visibility and transparency so that you're comfortable that we're spending the taxpayers' dollars wisely. So we've worked them closely on their reports, and we agree with their findings and are implementing the recommendations. You asked about risks. Probably the biggest risk to me is not really technical. It's the stability that was mentioned in some of the other opening statements of the program, the funding, the ability for us to stay the course and be able to go through administration changes and congressional cycles and be able to stay on a longer-term path. It really does take that long-term commitment to execute a program of this magnitude. This is the first time we've had a new space policy direction in 35 years, and it doesn't turn on a dime. So again, that's kind of my overarching what keeps me awake at night problem. But if you get down to the second one, technically, integration across all the different elements, the Orion, the first stage, the upper stage, the Orion, making sure that everything is properly integrated is one of the other biggest challenges in my mind. We have other technical issues, as any new rocket development program will have. Amongst those, we've got some of the thrust oscillation issues that you've been hearing about, and I mentioned in my opening statement. To me, that's nothing that's alarming. It's nothing that was unexpected. These are the types of things you run across when you start to develop new rockets and try to integrate them, and you get smarter as you try to mature towards PDR. The J2X was also mentioned. We've taken strides to add extra hardware to the program. We've also, one of the concerns of GAO was having enough test facilities. We've worked with the Space Shuttle main engine program to not only have the A1 test stand down at Stennis, which is currently doing J2X testing, but also to secure the A2 test stand to do some more early testing that we know will be challenged to do. We typically know that there are as many as 29 rework cycles in developing a new engine. And so you require an awful lot of testing to do that. But we feel like now we have a robust test program and a test plan, and we're marching forward with that. Another risk is the launch abort system, which is a new system. It actually contains 3 new solid rocket motors. They're small scale, but they are new solid rocket development programs. But we again have a robust test program to go address that. We've been doing some of the early motor firings. We actually just have delivered the Pad Abort 1 Orion simulator out to Dryden Flight Research Facility to be outfitted with avionics. That will be sent to White Sands Missile Range, where we will be doing an actual pad abort test by the end of this calendar year. And we have a series of those abort tests planned to prove out the concepts before we actually fly and put humans on board.
Thank you for that helpful analysis of where we are. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Feeney from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to follow up where the chairman left off. Ms. Chaplain, you've pointed out some of the challenges as we manage the program into the future. You've got an extensive report, which we appreciate. Do you agree with Dr. Gilbrech that despite the technical issues and despite the definitional issues that you described, that the biggest risk to the program is stability and in congressional and presidential leadership in the coming years?
I think because it is a very long-term effort that a commitment is absolutely needed through administrations as well as funding stability. One of the number one things that tends to disrupt programs that we review are funding shifts, stops, and starts, and it's really hampers what the program managers are trying to do in terms of execution, especially in space efforts where you have a lot of long lead items that you need to purchase. At the same time, there's other common things that programs tend to face that don't have to do with funding, and those issues are like requirements changes and some technical challenges, and I think those are always going to be present and need to be watched as this program moves forward.
Some of those you've laid out in your report.
Yeah.
Would you agree that it's fair to say that while your report is very comprehensive at noting the challenges ahead, that there have been no serious or fatal flaws thus far in advancing towards the program on NASA's part?
None that we have determined to be a fatal flaw.
Dr. Gilbrech, while our best scientists have been preparing to take humans beyond low Earth orbit, you may or may not have noticed that Americans have been involved in a political election year. And one of the potential collateral effects of that is that we may, in fact, have a continuing resolution, which Ms. Chaplain, a lot of us on this committee, would like to see something different. But if we have a continuing resolution for 09 that effectively provides 08 funding, what does that do for the March 2015 schedule that NASA is trying to obtain?
Congressman, we've looked at that, and it depends on the length of the continuing resolution. If it's a part-year resolution and we do wind up with an 08 funded level, or we get that passed, then there would be it wouldn't be as big of an impact. But if we did wind up with another year-long continuing resolution like we did in 07, our 08 budget to 09 would be decreased by about $350 million in exploration. And as we said, our rule of thumb in the program is about $100 million cut is about a month. So about 4 months of schedule delay on the March 2015.
Okay. Ms. Chaplain, I thought your report was very comprehensive. With respect to Congress's role, how should we take the challenges that you have laid out, and what should Congress be focused on? Should we be focused on definitional issues, milestones, critical decision points, program reviews? If you were the chairman and the ranking member, what would you be planning to do the next 3-4 years as oversight? Other than getting funding, but which is a given.
We always focus on several key milestones in a development program where we know that best practice organizations have gained certain pieces of knowledge at that point that makes them know it's okay to move forward. They have the assurance they need that what they're trying to do can be executed well. The first major milestone is this preliminary design review coming up. And what we like to see at that point is whether New technologies being developed are mature to a point where you can estimate costs and time and whether requirements are stable. So do you know what you're setting out to achieve, and do you know that you have the resources to achieve that? And that would be this upcoming preliminary design review. Then the midpoint of a program is usually the critical design review, and there we really look to see whether design is stable. And the common measure that's used is the number of design drawings that are releasable, and the indicator there, if there's about 90% drawings releasable, you have a good assurance that design is stable and you're ready to move forward to the next stages. Then when we get close to production, we look at some production indicators, whether the processes that are going to be used in production are stable or not. So with those three key gates, there's indicators you can use to see how the program's progressing. In addition to that, we always track things like software growth and whether assumptions about the use of heritage technologies and hardware are still valid in the program. And we also track things like weight growth, because in space programs that tends to be a particular issue if weight just creeps up during the development and if it's not addressed.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I hope with the indulgence of the committee we may have an opportunity for a second round subject to votes. But I would like to point out, if I may, that Ms. Chaplain's report is very comprehensive. She did state in her testimony that she hopes NASA will continue to be as candid as it has been thus far, and I think we ought to recognize that candor will be important for the GAO, for Congress, and the public, and we do appreciate the candor thus far. With that, I'll yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I also would note that the ranking member in his comments alluded to a job that all of us here in the committee have in regards to our potential presidential nominees. I'm counting on Congressman Feeney to ensure that Senator McCain understands the importance of the exploration initiative, and I know Congressman Lampson and I and other members on this side of the aisle will make sure that Senator Obama and Senator Clinton know this not only is important to NASA, but it's important to the country's economic future.
If I can respond just briefly, I want to assure the chairman that I, along with some great leaders at the Space Coast and around the country, really for space, gave an absolutely brilliant briefing on the importance of the space program. Unfortunately, we gave it to Governor Romney, who I had supported at the time. So, but we're in practice.
On that note, it's a great pleasure to recognize the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment, the member from Texas, Mr. Lampson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Feeney, get ready to make that presentation again as soon as you possibly can. Dr. Thornton, I think you're certainly right. It is indeed time for humans to go beyond low Earth orbit. I just hope that those humans are from the United States of America, that we don't lose the commitment that we've been talking about here and let someone else beat us to it. So obviously that's why we're here, and I hope that we can keep our focus. Understand what unbelievable returns we have gotten for our standard of living and quality of life and economy and everything else that NASA's given to us because of these dreams that we've achieved, strive to achieve and have indeed achieved. No question. But Dr. Gilbrech, if you were provided with a significant funding increase to the Constellation program on the order of $1 billion or $2 billion, what would you use the money for in specific terms, and how much of an impact would the extra funding have?
Yes, sir, Congressman. Of course, we support the President's budget, but if the Congress enact extra funds, we've reported previously in hearings that $1 billion in FY09 and $1 billion in FY10 would accelerate the initial operating capability at the 65% confidence level that we're currently holding back to September of 2013. We would simply have the reserves in the years that we need to address the kind of problems that we see that would bring us back into that 2013 time frame. I personally would like to also look at adding more robust flight test programs. That's something that we can never do enough of, is fly what we test what we've. You want to always fly and learn in the early test programs because all the ground analysis and ground tests never really quite fill in all the gaps that a flight test program does.
If U.S. access to the International Space Station was accelerated by this extra funding, would this have a commensurate effect on the projected human lunar landing date?
Right now, we're just in the early formulations for the human lunar return, and as was stated, our current goal is by 2019 to put boots back on the moon. So certainly progress in the early stages with the Ares 1 and the Orion would certainly make that much more higher confidence and potentially could pull that up, but it's a little far in the future for us to put that kind of fidelity to it. I think it would certainly make our 2020 commitment firm, our 2019 target much more achievable, and could potentially accelerate that date.
Ms. Chaplain, your testimony indicates that NASA's assessment that it could accelerate the Constellation program's initial operational capability date to 2013 with an additional $2 billion is highly optimistic. You go on to state that given the linear nature of a traditional test, analyze, fix, test cycle, even large funding increases offer no guarantee of program acceleration. Given the difficult situation we find ourselves in with the possibility of a 5-year gap, what credible options do we have for closing that gap if we don't add more money to the Constellation program?
I think I agree with what Dr. Gilbrech was saying, that the funding could be used to increase your confidence levels of hitting that 2013 date. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to speed up activities that are already laid out on the books, because they're already pretty highly compressed, and testing does have to occur in a sequence. So I'm not doubting that they could have more confidence to the 2013 date. What we meant to say was there's only so much you can do to shrink what's already there for certain aspects of the program. That would be the J2X engine and the upper stage, that it's highly unlikely you're going to get those things to come under what schedules they have now. As I understand it, the schedules are sort of laid out to hit the 2013 mark. Extra money would help you have more confidence in that. Even at a 65% confidence level, you still have to recognize that's 35% confidence you might not hit that, you won't hit that date.
Dr. Gilbrech, do you agree with Ms. Chaplin's assessment of the feasibility of accelerating the Constellation program if more money was added? If not, why not? What are your thoughts?
I think we're in agreement that the reserves allow us to tackle problems against that aggressive 2013 schedule date. But again, our external commitment is the March 2015, because we know we can sign up and meet that date at the 65%. I don't get hung up on 65% because I really see this as a very achievable architecture. I've worked a lot of programs that have tried to replace the shuttle, so I have some scars underneath my jacket here. The X-30 program was the Ronald Reagan era of the Orient Express. That was an air breather that was supposed to take us up to orbit, a huge technological challenge and a revolutionary leap in technology. I also worked the X-33, and here we're trying to go single stage to orbit. It was a composite vehicle, had a linear aerospike engine which worked beautifully, but unfortunately the fuel tank technology wound up derailing that program. So we're using a very evolved technology approach here. We're using shuttle solid rocket boosters that have a rich flight heritage. We're using upper stage with J2X engines that have their roots in Apollo heritage. So from my mind, the schedule, I have very high confidence in the 2015 date, and with the if there were additional money, the 65% would just buy us the additional confidence in the 2013 aggressive date. So I view it more as we have a very evolved, achievable technology path ahead of us than anything I've seen in the past.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Lampson, Dr. Hinners, I couldn't help but note that you mentioned the Witness Protection Program earlier in your remarks, and I know of no witnesses come before this committee that's needed the Witness Protection Program. I do, however, suggest that given what I know about Mr. Lampson's congressional district and Mr. Rohrbacher's congressional districts, that they may at some point need the Witness Protection Program. And on that note, I did want to recognize the gentleman from California who's a very engaged and productive and contributing member of the committee, Dr. Congressman Rohrbacher from the great state of California. I don't know that he's actually a doctor, but we treat him as one. So, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just one note: after you've been here 20 years, but the most poignant, I guess, the most visible aspect is that up here, when I got here 20 years ago, the witnesses were all older than I was, and now they seem to be younger than I am. And over that 20 years, I've noticed, and I certainly understand, and I've heard this before, about the instability of our funding, the effect that it has on a long-term space program and obtaining long-term goals. Let me just note that what I perceive is that instability of funding can be traced back to the fact that it's almost impossible for people to prioritize spending. If we were able to prioritize in the beginning, we would have much more stability. That lack of ability to prioritize is not just on the part of Congress, however, it is also on the part of the space community. So what I would ask you now, Thornton, of course, who just came from this robust discussion, what areas have been identified as the least justified spending that's going on in space, on our space program today? And anyone, Dr. Thornton, you, did anyone identify, see, everyone can talk about what should be plussed up. No one's willing to talk about what should be not be in the budget. So maybe you could help me. Was there any discussion about things that were not justified that we're spending money on today?
I don't know that I can say that there's a discussion of not justified, but I think there was pretty widespread agreement that what has happened on the space station has not captured the public's attention. And orbiting the Earth over and over and over again is not capturing or holding the public's attention. That what we need to do is have these goals. Maybe Mars is too far in the future.
So you're saying your recommendation would be to cut funds for the space station program?
Well, I think that we have to finish it for international partners. I think that's.
You want to actually spend more money on it? Okay. Frankly, this is what we got for the last 20 years. This is what I've identified. Not one witness, and I've asked this question dozens of times, has ever been able to tell me what is the least justified spending. They're always willing to say, well, we want to have, they all have their own special program they want to plus up. Does anyone else have anything they want to jump in as well?
I think I said that we needed to balance expectations and budget. And, I think that.
Well, I'm not asking for balance. I'm asking for what you would like to cut spending on. And
nothing.
And if we could get.
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay. Well, that's why you don't have, that's why we don't have a stable program, is no one's willing to say it. Are any other witnesses willing to tell me where it's the least justified? Okay. So nothing's changed. Let me just note, it's not just the responsibility of Congress. It's also the responsibility of you and the rest of the people in the space community to tell us this. Now, all we get is people telling us where we need to spend more. Well, if we want stable spending, we got to find out where we need to spend less and get some good expertise advice on it so we can set priorities. One of the things that I've seen that might help us out in terms of making sure that we have the resources available to meet the goals, which, of course, people are willing to say we need to spend more money on, is perhaps an initiative that would not cost money, initiatives that would not cost actually more money, but actually might give us more bang for the buck. One would be, and which I pushed on, is trying to find as many opportunities for commercial space endeavors, which could then bring new revenue into our whole concept. Where are there any opportunities there that you see in terms of space exploration and the attracting new commercial endeavors?
Yes, sir, Congressman Rohrabacher. We, as I said in my statement, we reinstated full funding for the commercial orbital transportation services. We now have 2 funded partners with SpaceX and Orbital Sciences was recently added. We also have 5 unfunded partners in our Space Act agreements, and we're very encouraged with the progress they're making, and we would really like to stimulate this market and get us out of the responsibility of low Earth orbit cargo delivery. So I see that as budding. And then we also are encouraged by Google X Prize and some of the other things that are really capturing the
Thank you very much. I see
imagination.
my time is up. If the chair would indulge me one last thought, and quickly, one of the other, space commercialization is, of course, something that could give us another area that I've identified is more expanded space cooperation, especially in the moon effort. I would think anybody who is committed to this project, which I am, would think that the new president of the United States, or the current president, or hopefully a future president, Democrat or Republican, could go and see our friends in Russia and establish a whole new initiative based on a partnership to go to the moon. Russians have a lot to contribute, which would then open up resources for us to expand our efforts. So I would call on the new president to make a new major initiative with Russia, see if they can become partners in our. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Many other partners probably interested in that, Mr. Rohrabacher. Thank you. And while that line of questioning was going on, Chairman Udall had to on to another matter and left the chair and has turned over the gavel to me. So I will be sitting in this chair for the next few minutes. And with that, as we move to the second round of questioning, I will recognize myself as acting chair for the next 5 minutes. And let me just throw a question out here for your comments for just a minute. Anybody like to make a comment on it, putting aside for a moment the issues that we've discussed today about how best to implement a human exploration program. It appears to me that each of you thinks it's worthwhile for the nation to undertake human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. Why do you think it's important for the nation to explore beyond low Earth orbit? And I'd like to begin.
Certainly would lead off, since it's my prime job one to get us there. I believe we need to lead space exploration to really be viewed as a global leader and maintain our global preeminence. I also see it as a strategic capability. Whenever you see things that pop up all across in different applications, you should recognize them as strategic capabilities. The Department of Defense uses space, NASA uses space, commercial is interested in space, our international partners are interested in human exploration of space. So I view that as us to maintain our edge as global leadership. That's probably the key reason. As mentioned here, I view also that the moon is a stepping stone to Mars. Some of the Mars missions, even if I were told that was my prime directive tomorrow, I would not alter the path I'm on today. We have so much to learn from the moon, and being 3 days away from home, to be able to prove out the technologies we need for a 30-month mission to Mars, I see that as the most responsible and achievable way we can build that kind of an architecture. I personally believe there's also a lot of science interest left to be discovered on the moon. I mean, we've had the Apollo program, for all of its accomplishments. We put 12 people on the surface for 3-day stints at a time, and that's a landmass or surface area the size of Africa. And to say we've exhausted all the scientific discovery there doesn't compute to me.
Anyone else want to make a comment?
Yes, I'd like to add to that. I think you've raised a very basic question of essentially why humans in space. To me, it does go beyond the science. Indeed, astronauts can conduct a lot of science activity, but also we can do a lot, and maybe even a lot more, robotically. But humans can add to the accomplishment of science and do things which today, and even in the near future, are not possible to do robotically, or would cost almost as much to do robotically as they do by having the added cost of humans in space. But I also add that there is an element of humans that you do not do robotically. Some 30 years ago, I was asked that question, and to me it was one of, you don't transmit the human spirit through an antenna. you need to be there, in place, in person. So I do support it. And I see that in the young people at the University of Colorado, the engineering students and the science students. They are motivated in space-related things by two things: robotics and human exploration. These kids have something in their psyche that says there is something exceptional about humans leaving Earth and going out to explore, becoming part of the larger cosmos.
Dr. Thornton, thank you, Dr. Hinners. Dr. Thornton, you testified that that human missions to the moon by the year 2020 are exceedingly unlikely. Why do you feel that?
I have to say that's not based on any engineering analysis. It's a guess based on Murphy's Law and its corollary that stuff happens. And stuff that happens rarely accelerates the schedule or reduces the cost. So, as I said, it's a guess.
Okay. Let me step back from the near-term issues related to CEV and CLV and take a look at the broader exploration program. This committee and this Congress will be reauthorizing NASA in 2008. What questions and issues do you think are the most important ones for Congress to consider as it examines NASA's plans for exploration beyond low Earth orbit? Dr. Gilbrech.
Well, as been stated here, the question is, do we want to get out of low Earth orbit and go on to our exploration journey? And again, as I said, that requires stability. The answers we're trying to provide is not just an Apollo capability. We're providing an expanded capability. It really does build the architecture to go beyond Lunar and on to Mars and other destinations. So our architecture will put 4 people on the surface of the moon compared to the Apollo program that put 3 down. 3-day stays versus the 7-day stays that we'll be doing. Also, the outpost mode that we'll go into for 6-month stays. All this builds the infrastructure to put the mass in orbit that we'll need for the eventual Mars missions. That would be my answer.
Would anyone else comment on that before I release the...
I would like to know that everything, that we have an end goal in mind, and every step that happens for the next 30 years points toward that goal and not toward dead ends or false starts.
Dr. Hinners?
Yes, in the 2008 appropriations bill, there is language that prohibits NASA from doing research, development, or studies on things that are exclusively related to human exploration of Mars. That has a perverse effect of preventing NASA from constructing an integrated exploration architecture. In my mind, one would start with requirements for Mars, feed that back into a lunar architecture, rather than the other way around. And so I would like to see the Congress reverse that restriction so that NASA can better construct an integrated, long-term architecture to assure that we're doing the most sensible things in our earlier stepping stones.
I'll be happy to give you the name of 1 or 2 members of Congress who specifically feel very strongly in this area, and I'd love to go with you to go visit them. I might even arrange that meeting if I could get you to come.
I'd be happy
Chaplain,
to participate.
Did you want to make a comment, or?
Yeah, the decision to go beyond low Earth orbit, it's a very costly endeavor, so that kind of decision needs to be weighed against all the other discretionary priorities competing for funding, and not just within NASA, but external to NASA. It was mentioned earlier that we have issues with terms of prioritizing programs for funding, and that's across the entire government. So when you're looking at something like this that's very long-term, it's going to be very costly, you need to make that decision in light of your other priorities.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Feeney.
Thank you. The chair's invited me to participate in that meeting too, and I'll be glad to go. On that note, Dr. Gilbrech, Congress last year, as a matter of policy, for reasons of compromise, which is what we have to do to get things done up here, actually prohibited any money from being spent on the Mars exploration program. So at least for this year's budget, we are prohibited from doing what Dr. Hinners has suggested. Has that significantly impacted NASA's development of the Constellation program?
Well, as they said, it does have a somewhat chilling effect down at the lower levels because engineers see that and they think we are not even to think of Mars, as opposed to the letter of the language. It says we will not spend $2,008 on anything specific to the human return or human landing on Mars. So we are of course following the law. We would hope to see that changed in future years. We are trying to develop all of our lunar plans that will be extensible to Mars. And I think that's one of the flexibilities and the beauties of our architecture is that all the things that we are going to do and need to do to survive and prove out these technologies on the moon will eventually someday pay off for a Mars mission.
And Dr. Thornton, Mr. Lamson just asked a question about why it is important to have humans in space to do this exploration. A number of scientists have pointed out that it's less risky, it's less costly, and more efficient for some purposes to send robots or to send machines. I note that one of the people that participated in your workshop said that humans should replace unmanned opportunities as soon as possible when exploration has transitioned from reconnaissance to meaning. It went on to say that humans solve puzzles and find meaning in data, albeit at a higher cost than our robotic surrogates. I recently watched one of the news shows suggest that robots are being developed that can, how do I put this delicately, become romantic partners for humans. I'm delighted to hear somebody defend our species, number one. And number two, were there other people that participated in that workshop that gave, in addition to what we've heard from Dr. Gilbrech and Dr. Hinners, reasons why humans need to be part of space exploration?
We did talk about the goals of science and exploration being different, whereas humans can help science, and science certainly enables the human expansion into the solar system. The basic motivations for that is entirely different. I had a conversation earlier in the week with a professor of anthropology about the migrations of humans around the planet over the last however many thousands of years, and he told me that it's cultures that don't recognize their limits that tend to expand and colonize. Well, I hope that we don't recognize our limits, and I hope that this isn't the generation that decides this is it, we've hit our limits, we're not going anywhere else. So I think it's that inspiration that is part of it. I think it's that drive in us that is part of us. And another workshop participant remarked, they don't name high schools after robots. And so it's, I think that is the drive for us to do it. Certainly we need to enable science. The participant who said that humans should replace robots when exploration has transitioned from reconnaissance to meaning was actually one of the scientists, and I was very surprised at the support from the scientists in the group for human exploration as a tool for them. Some of them were very adamant that there are things that humans can do that robots cannot, and that the intellectual, the putting together of the pieces, the understanding, which rock to go after is innate to humans, and we don't build robots to do that yet.
Well, and I have some of the same fears you do, that it might be, if we're not careful, 2019 or so before we get back to the moon. You cited Murphy's Law and others to suggest that that's what, you basically get a sense, and that things just simply don't get accelerated. But I'd point out that it's sometimes, on rare instances, things do get accelerated around here. And I'm afraid that we may need another Sputnik-type moment. The Chinese have over 100 universities working on, for example, lunar rover equipment. That's what they admit to. Most of it's done within their Defense Department, which is a very shadowy. And while Chairman Udall suggested that we hope we don't get back into a space race, the truth of the matter is we just don't know what the Chinese long-term intentions are. They're not part of our international partners. One of the reasons I'm going to China is to explore what they're up to and how we can cooperate if possible, but if not, I hope it doesn't take another Sputnik-type moment for us to re-energize our human exploration capabilities. And if it does, I sure hope it doesn't come too late to put our program and the workforce and the talents back together. It's a fear I think about every day. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Feeney. I think Sputnik's here. I think the fact that the Japanese have a satellite around our moon right now, the fact that China has just said that they will beat us to the surface of the moon, if we don't wake up and respond to that, why should not we believe that others will begin to claim our position of technological leadership in this world? Shame on us if we allow it to happen, I believe. Mr. Robacher, more words of wisdom.
Thank you very much. I am concerned about Chinese involvement, while at the same time I'm certainly very positive about cooperation with the Russians. Still maintain the world's worst human rights abusers. I would be very supportive of any efforts that we have to ensure that the Chinese do not overtake us and space endeavors. And one of the ways we can do that is to make sure that we are being realistic, limited resources that we have. And I just want to make sure that people read this record of this hearing, that they do not come away thinking there is any type of consensus that we should be making Mars the driving force for prioritizing our spending. That is about as that would be perverse. That would be giving up what we can accomplish today for something that is a majestic dream as we march to the future. But that's not the way to have a realistic and a responsible policy for America's space exploration. Let me just for the record say that I am 100% in favor of that limitation, saying that we should not be spending money on things that are exclusively are for accomplishing a future manned Mars mission. We have other things we need to do. Do we need to fix the Hubble telescope? The chairman of this subcommittee took the leadership on ensuring that we did not just let that asset go, and that cost us some money. And quite frankly, I supported that. Should we be making sure that we have a very robust system for identifying near-Earth objects that may indeed be a threat to the Earth? And should we establish a system on how to counteract those threats if we find something headed in our direction? The answer is yes. Should we be utilizing space so we can put a greater effort into conserving and utilizing the Earth's resources for the benefit of humankind? Yes. All of those things cost money. It would be a horrible disservice to the people of the world, and especially to the taxpayers of the United States, for us to start prioritizing our spending based on the idea of stepping a human foot on Mars 30 or 40 years down the road. That would be a horrible misuse of the money when we have other things that we need to do that can help people right now. So let me make sure that that's thoroughly on the record. And again, how are we going to make sure that we utilize the resources that we have more effectively? And we've talked about, at least I brought up today, commercialization and cooperation, and my colleagues have talked about cooperation as well. So, but let me just say that cooperation does not mean that the United States of America should step back from developing its own technology and making sure that we are the leaders in space technology. We can do that by relying perhaps on with others to help us produce, let's say, the less advanced technologies, or give us some insights. Just one last question. I see my time. Does anyone in this panel have any? Believe me, this is just inquiry. Does anyone in this panel have any information about any federal government agency, including NASA, being involved in any way in anti-gravity research? Say yes or no that I do know or don't know this right down the line. You don't know? You don't know? Okay, this is just for my thank you very much.
I have more questions, so if you don't mind, we can continue our questioning. Dr. Gilbrech, one of the more controversial decisions in the exploration program was the decision to develop the Ares 1 and Ares 5 launch vehicles rather than modifying the existing Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle, ELV, family used by DoD. In addition, some have criticized NASA for developing 2 new launch vehicles rather than a single launch vehicle as proposed in the so-called direct concept. Did NASA examine the alternatives of using either an EELV-based architecture or the direct architecture instead of the Ares 1 and Ares 5 approach? And if so, why did you wind up rejecting those approaches? You can provide more detailed answer. Give me whatever you can now.
Yes, sir, Congressman, and Mike Griffin elaborated it much more eloquently than I did in his recent speech, which was part of the charter of the hearing today. But in summary, yes, those were traded very thoroughly using the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle as a starting point for our current architecture. It had several weaknesses as far as having to human rate that rocket, which has been an expendable and not been human rated. It would have also required an upper stage development like the Ares 1 rocket. So those are some of the challenges there. It also didn't address the heavy lift element that would require us to go with the Ares 5 development that we're doing here. So in terms of cost, schedule, and risk, it just did not trade equally with the current architecture that we picked. And that was reviewed and vetted with the Department of Defense, the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, and all agreed that we had picked the best scenario. The other one you mentioned, the direct launcher, there was a similar architecture like that was in that exploration systems architecture study. The claims for the direct launcher, we've actually had our Ares projects look at that, and we can't justify, based on laws of physics, the performance that are being claimed by that approach. So we don't claim to have a market on good ideas, but we also like to go investigate them and make sure they're credible, and we believe we have the best architecture on the books.
Dr. Gilbert, Dr. Hinners testified that bringing potential partners in early in the concept formation phase where they contribute to structuring the basic approach strikes me as the right way to approach international cooperation. Do you agree? And if not, why not?
I agree wholeheartedly. In fact, we just had announced our lunar assignments back in October, and we're intentionally leaving the architecture, certain elements of that, open to international and commercial participation. We've cordoned off certain things that we think are critical, such as the base transportation infrastructure to get there, the lunar lander, the architecture here, the spacesuit systems, and the navigation and communication. We want to make sure that those elements get established, and certain desires for us to lead the specs and the standards of what that does. It's kind of common to, if you fly around the world today, air traffic controllers speak English no matter which airline you're on, and there's a reason for that. So there are advantages to being, to taking control of certain aspects of early exploration. But we also are very much engaged. We have a global exploration strategy team that started in 2006. It was over 1,000 participants. 14 space agencies have participated. We took over 800 objectives for the lunar environment, both robotic and scientific, and we boiled those down to 180 objectives, and we've also stated 6 specific goals, and that involves all the international communities are interested in participating with us.
NASA was involved in formulating the global exploration strategy framework for cooperation. What, if any, steps has NASA taken since then? Is there a concrete plan to implement the strategy, and what are the next steps as you see them?
Yes, sir. There's a follow-up working group that will continue to meet and mature ideas. We're working with all the agencies as we go through our cycles of what we think the surface and power systems on the moon, all the other elements that are up for cooperation as they mature. We want to match each country's desires and their strengths to what we believe they can fill in the lunar architecture. So I think we have a very robust communication with the international community and have an open door to them to participate.
Dr. Hinners, you indicated in your testimony that ITAR is an impediment to effective cooperation in NASA's exploration initiative. Do you have a sense of how much of an impact ITAR would could have on our ability to carry out a cooperative lunar exploration program?
I can't give you a quantitative answer to that. Yet I have seen over the years that the ITAR has made it more difficult to first even bring foreign participants onto a site, whether it be a Jet Propulsion Lab or Lockheed Martin, and creates an antagonism that results in an atmosphere of cooperating with you is such a headache that I'm not sure I want to do it. So to the degree that we can ease some of the restrictions and make it easier for our foreign partners to actually work directly with us and not feel as if they're outsiders that we let in only on a very selective basis, I think we would get better cooperation. I say this all realizing that ITAR has some well-intended and necessary functions, so I'm not suggesting we try to get rid of ITAR, but to work closely with NASA and the State Department to see if there are ways to make it easier to bring our foreign partners into a closer cooperative environment with us.
Anyone else want to comment? Yes, ma'am. Ms. Chaplain.
I'm not an ITAR expert, but I know that GAO has issued several reports that show that programs can do a lot to mitigate all the challenges with ITAR if they do planning really very much early ahead. And the Joint Strike Fighter program was one such program that had to learn how to think through what things they had to work with in ITAR several years in advance. I also believe the space station effort has probably given NASA a lot of lessons learned in terms of working under ITAR, so they should go back now and see like what kind of foundation do we need to lay now so that we don't have some of these issues later on.
Thank you very much. You're recognized.
Yeah, well, just on the ITAR point, one of the things that the administrators asked us for this year is relief from the ITAR situation with respect to the Soyuz, which unfortunately will be serving the International Space Station for a short period. I know that some folks that, like me, want to narrow or eliminate the gap have suggested that we simply not reenact ITAR to force Congress's hands to fund an elimination of the gap. I think that is a very high-risk strategy, and would be worried about people who are suggesting that must be buying lottery tickets to take care of their retirement years, because that's a big gamble. With respect, by the way, I think Congressman Rohrbacher is no longer here. I think he said it right when there's no consensus about whether we ought to go to Mars. I think some of us clearly think that that is a great ultimate destination that will help inform, I think as Dr. Hinners suggested, help inform the way we take the interim steps. But in addition to Mars, are there other destinations, near-Earth objects, for example? Every dozen or couple dozen billion years we have a asteroid or that literally strikes the or meteorite that strikes not just as damage but dramatically changes the planet, and we have a lot more potential impacts on a smaller scale. Are there destinations that would be useful in the ultimate goals of the vision as set out? Dr. Hinners or Dr. Thornton, do you want to address that?
There are
somewhere in between Moon and Mars.
There are some intermediate goals that we could look at both for technology development and for science. One is near-Earth asteroids. Those missions could be a year or so, and that could be our first step out of the Earth's gravity well and longer duration flights. Also, missions to the moons of Mars, which would be similar duration to Mars missions but would not require landing and launch systems to get people there and back. And so there are some destinations that would advance both the technology and the science between now and a mission to Mars.
Dr. Hinners, anything to add?
I would agree with what Dr. Thornton has said, and missions to Sun-Earth, Lagrangian points, as they're called, and then near-Earth objects can incrementally, what I call, stress the systems. Today, we would not dare undertake a 3-year transit to and from Mars. And developing that capability is not going to be easy, but I think doing it incrementally, not going for 3 years first, but maybe 1 month to the Lagrangian points, and then many months, maybe half a year, to a near-Earth object, could cause us to get on a path of incremental development. Also, that would feed back into using LEO, which still has some uses, to develop some of these capabilities. The International Space Station, in which we have invested somewhere between $35 and $40 billion just in development, exclusive of launch costs. We've put a major investment there. Let us milk that investment, not excessively, obviously, but let us take the best use of that investment to help develop these future capabilities.
Well, and on that note, Dr. Gilbrech, getting down into some of the details of the programs that we're working on, the COTS program was originally conceived to include opportunities for both cargo to the shuttle and crew. We have not funded any of the crew potential. Is that a priority for NASA? If it's something that you had some additional funding, would you prioritize? What is the potential for crew development capabilities before 2015 when we have the the Constellation up and working?
Yes, well, you're correct. Right now, our funded agreements only go through the uncrewed, the cargo capability. So we're currently doing analysis on what it would take to accelerate that crewed capability with our current COTS partners or the commercial market right now. And we're in the final stages of vetting that, and we'd be happy to share that with us, the details of that with this committee. But we view any and all sources to close the gap as ones we should be pursuing.
And Ms. Chaplain, that's one private program that's not it's not under NASA direct management and control. What should Congress be watching for as COTS is developed specifically?
You're correct that this is under a different kind of funding mechanism, and traditionally government agencies don't get that same kind of insight that they have when it's a more traditional contracting mechanism. But as I understand it, in this case, NASA does have some insight into these key gates that the COTS program will be passing through, things like critical design review and the flight readiness testing. So again, just as with the Ares and the Orion, at these key gates, you want to take some criteria and see how well the programs bounce up against it, including technology readiness, design readiness, production readiness. There's a pretty important test coming up on SpaceX of their return to flight mission for their Falcon 1 vehicle, and that will tell us a lot if they have good standing going forward for participating with the space station, if there's this test coming up is successful.
And just briefly, Dr. Gilbrech, do you have some high level of confidence that COTS is on target right now based on NASA's involvement?
Yes, sir. This first element of COTS that we funded in exploration is a Space Act agreement, and that's where the NASA is basically a co-investor in developing the technology. And we track them in their milestones, and that includes the reviews that Chaplain identified. We also work with them on visiting vehicle requirements that ensures they know how to approach and dock with the International Space Station safely. So I view they're making good progress. This is a tough business. SpaceX we recently renegotiated some of their milestones. They're all technical problems that we would normally expect in any type of a new rocket development program. So that resulted in a 6-month slip from their original planned demo of cargo in September of 2009 to March of 2009 or of 10. But again, this is nothing out of the ordinary that alarms us. So we have high confidence.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. If I could ask one more question, I think I'm done for the day. Well, thank you for your indulgence and your leadership here. I mentioned that I'm going to China, I have some real concerns because I don't believe we know the long-term intentions of the Chinese. I think that they'll be fairly friendly until after the Summer Olympics this year. After that, a lot of us just don't know what their intentions are, but their capabilities with respect to developing deep blue water naval capabilities, dramatic increase in defense funding, and especially in space, are very impressive, and I think we have to pay close attention. Having said that, one area that I sort of lean towards immediate cooperation with the Chinese is to share the potential capability for the Chinese Shenzhou vehicle to hook up with the space station without necessarily agreeing to let them do it or not. It would be an alternative to relying on the Russians or the potential development of COPS crew capabilities. Does anybody have some last-minute advice before I head off to Beijing on that specific issue?
I mean, from my perspective, China's participating in the global exploration strategy, but we have no current collaborations and work with them, and I have to defer to my counterpart in space operations and our administrator for those levels.
Okay. Dr. Hinners?
I would add, I would encourage you on your trip. I was participant in the 70s in working with the Soviets and made 6 not-so-fun trips to Russia at that time, or Soviet Union.
Vodka's good, isn't it?
But in that environment, which was not a friendly environment at top levels during the Cold War, we did make good progress. We're able to, I think, use the space program as a political arm, if you will, and accomplish things jointly that contributed to furthering the eventual Soviet Union, now Russia, that is more democratic and open. So I look on the space program as an opportunity to help work some of the world's political problems.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Feeney. Good questions. Dr. Gilbrech, it has been reported that NASA's planned Ares 5 heavy lift vehicle is not able to meet its lunar mission requirements as currently conceived and will need some beefing up. Consequently, the agency is said to be studying a variety of options to boost the lift capability of the big new rocket. And if this is so, is this so, first of all? And if so, what options are under consideration?
Yes, sir. This is a very challenging mission, and as I said before, we are putting much more capability on the lunar surface to be able to go potentially to 6-month outposts. That requires a lot of lift capability to translunar injection. And right now, our current target for Ares 5 is 65 metric tons of lift, and we see that with the capabilities that we're maturing with our lunar architecture, that we would like to push that beyond that, and we have concepts now to take it up to 75 metric tons. They involve upgrades of the solid rocket motor with the propellant grains. There are concepts of going from 5 RS-68 engines to 6 RS-68 engines. We're looking at other weight-saving measures as far as composite casings for the 5-segment booster. Potentially making them, not recovering them, making them expendable and saving some weight in the parachute system. So we've got a suite of options that we're considering, and again, we'll just have to mature those, but it is a challenge.
What's it likely to do to the 5-year funding requirements?
Well, the Ares 5 funding really doesn't kick in until 2011. So right now our current budgets, these are all just trades that we're looking at, concept trades as the design matures. So right now I don't see any impact in our current budget horizon, but we certainly would inform the Congress if we saw that was an issue that we needed to raise.
Thanks. Dr. Hinners, what do we need to accomplish on the moon to enable human exploration of Mars or other potential destinations as called for in the President's vision for space exploration? And what enabling technologies are techniques required for human exploration of Mars cannot be accomplished on the moon?
From what I have seen of the lunar architecture, one of the prime things it will contribute is how to even exist and operate for a long time on a planetary surface. And lunar habitat at an outpost would help accomplish those goals. What it will not do is develop the capability for the long-duration space flight that is necessary for a Mars mission. We've talked about that previously. There are other elements of Mars. The environment at Mars is so different from that at the Moon that a lot of things you do on the surface of the Moon have relatively little applicability to eventual Mars human exploration. For example, the in situ resource utilization. At Mars, you'd use probably at a first go-around the atmosphere. Of course, on the Moon, there's no atmosphere. So developing a technique to use lunar regolith might not have much capability, but it would advance some of the engineering, although that whole concept of in situ resource utilization is fraught with potential engineering problems that we haven't even started to face. So in many ways, I think the lunar exploration is a stepping stone, but not the most important ones that we'll eventually need if we're going to Mars with humans.
Dr. Thornton, would you comment?
I agree with Dr. Hinners about the engineering challenges of building a semi-permanent outpost on the Moon can lead us to solving some of those problems on Mars. The issues, the physiological issues of getting from Earth to Mars and long-duration space flight are something we probably will not solve on the Moon, but some of the other intermediate steps of going to the Earth-Sun Lagrange points or going to near-Earth asteroids can lead us a step further down the road to solving those sorts of problems.
Dr. Hinners, let me ask some questions regarding NASA exploration's hardware, or architecture, excuse me. What do you see as the greatest risks that need to be addressed in preparing for human exploration beyond low Earth orbit?
The greatest risk, in my view, is inadequate budgets that will cause us to either so reduce the requirements that we're not making much real progress in developing a capability, or stretching it out so far that we're investing the bulk of our funding in just staying in place and not really making good progress in getting beyond where we are today.
How can we, I was going to ask you about something that would lead slightly differently. I thought maybe you'd give me a little different answer than that, but how do we address that? I was going to ask you to address the perspectives on NASA, on how NASA would address that risk, but how should Congress address the risk that you just presented to us of funding?
I wish I had a good answer for you. The old proverbial one of, well, more money obviously is not an acceptable answer today with the budget situation that we have. So to me, the only alternative is for NASA to very carefully look at its stepwise approach to be sure that we're doing just those things that will lead to the development of the essential ingredients of the lunar architecture. Let me give you an example, and some of my science friends would not be very enamored with this, but the outpost, if you're looking at stepping stones, has much more utility than science-driven sortie missions, even though for science sortie missions may give you more immediate return. So if one has to make a choice, I'd say do the outpost and not the sortie missions. You may have to make choices like that.
Do you believe that NASA's exploration architecture is robust and capable of accommodating risks?
I can't answer that. I don't know enough about the details. Give you a good answer on that.
Would Dr. Gilbrech or anybody else, would any of you care to comment on any of those questions?
Yes, sir, I'd be glad to. I believe the architecture is robust, it's flexible, it can handle the pay-as-you-go environment that we find ourselves in. We also, as far as being stuck in the lunar outpost mode, we've talked about that with the lunar architecture teams as far as what is logical exit strategies. When do we consider we've learned enough to say that we don't need a permanently manned outpost at the lunar surface? Some of the things, though, we've learned on the International Space Station, which has been permanently has humans permanently in space for the last 7.5 years, is we learn a lot more with that extended presence than we do on 14-day shuttle missions. So Really, the outpost has a lot of value in the fact that it will drive out a lot of problems we wouldn't necessarily find on 7-day sortie missions. They complement each other, but I think they're both necessary. We also are learning a lot on the International Space Station about the 6-month transit time that it takes to go to Mars. There's a lot of things that we're learning about microgravity, bone loss, muscle atrophy, radiation exposure, some of the things that we worry about for the astronauts on that long journey. The moon is a good analog for Mars as far as the gravity effects, and whether a 1/6 gravity on the moon, you have 1/3 gravity, Earth gravity on Mars, how does that counteract some of these bone loss and other effects that we see in microgravity? So we hope that we can answer some of those long-range questions with the lunar analog. And as far as in situ resource utilization, we also want to follow the water, and if we can find water on the moon, which is why we're choosing some of our landing sites at the South Pole, we can learn how to make fuel, oxygen, and that we could potentially apply to a Martian site if we were to find water on Mars.
Thank you very, very much. I would be remiss if I allowed the comments about Mr. Rohrbacher made about not wanting to make a priority about going to Mars. I think that maybe slightly misunderstood some of the point that was made here. Obviously, regardless of what we're doing through our efforts, I hate to see us turn a blind eye to Mars and not include that in the mix as we go through all of this. But my point, and then I'll call on you, Dr. Thornton, was what we learned when there were those who said we shouldn't even be trying to go to the moon. But it affected me personally when I had my LASIK surgery. The tracking that the machines that the ophthalmologist used was an adaptation from what we have used and do use in docking and even weapons and many other kinds of things that we've used in space. The advancements that have been made on heart surgery I had a year ago are significant. Those things are affecting millions of lives on this planet. The return that we get from our exploration, from our willingness to explore where we haven't been, I think is absolutely critical. What would you say or add?
When in the 1980s, the tagline for the International Space Station, as an astronaut, I was part of the PR machine, started out the next logical step, and then it morphed to a permanent outpost in space when we lost sight of what that was a step 2. And in the process, NASA engaged a lot of scientists in areas of microgravity science and life science and nurtured those fields and grew them and funded them because they would be the users of this permanent outpost in space. Again, I was part of that. My last mission was a space lab mission, and a lot of those experiments were on there only because it was a warm-up for their permanent stay on a space station. Well, in 2004, we changed our mind, and we turned off a lot of those people. We unfunded a lot of those people. We basically ended their career in that field. We ended those fields. And, in retrospect, not having a view of what this was a step 2 was not responsible as far as how we treated people nor how we handled the taxpayers' money. And that's what I'd like to not see on the moon. I think there's a lot of things we can learn on the moon on our way to Mars, but to not have a vision of what it is a step 2, I think is what is irresponsible.
Thank you very, very much. And you're going to be making the last word. Okay, well, no, you're not.
Well,
Mr. Feeney.
I don't have any more questions, but I just wanted to, on the international cooperation front, share with the committee and the people in the audience that at 10:45 today, the ATV hooked up with the International Space Station. The European Space Agency now is a prominent national space enterprise. I think do we have some people in the audience from the European Space Agency? If you don't mind raising your hand, well, congratulations. Yeah, we were very thrilled with the news, and with that, I want to thank the witnesses and the chairman again.
Thank you, Mr. Feeney, and thank each and every one of you for being here. I think it's been an interesting conversation, and I look forward to more of them, to future meetings. If there's no objection, the record will remain open for additional statements from members and for answers to any follow-up questions that the subcommittee may ask of the witnesses. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.